This is going to be a tough one. World War II was definitely the golden era of tanks, and considering there have been thousands of them deployed during the conflict, making a true 100% accurate ranking list, it's a real deal. There are many variables that should be taken in consideration, but in this video, I'm going to keep it simple. The following 10 tanks are listed by taking into account their effectiveness in combat and their simplicity of construction. Number 10. S-35 from France. Have you ever heard about this tank? Built from 1936 until 1940 to equip the French armored divisions, it was for its time a relatively agile medium-weight tank, superior in armor and armament to its foreign competitors. After numerous testing, the S-35 entered in mass production, with a total of 600 units originally ordered. But later, budgetary restraints led to a more gradual and limited procurement, resulting in a total pre-war orders of 450 units. It was armed with a 47mm gun, which proved to be quite effective against the tanks used by the Germans during the first stages of the conflict. It was constructed from well-sloped armor sections that, however, made it quite expensive and not easy to maintain. During the German invasion of May 1940, the S-35 proved itself to be tactically effective, but this was negated by the French command's strategic mistakes in deploying their cavalry armored divisions. Even though these units performed as they could, with high losses, but with some successes, most of them being advocated to the S-35 armor and firepower, the Germans systematically outmaneuvered the French, with excellent communication and support, proving that old tactics from the book were utterly obsolete. After the defeat of France in June 1940, captured S-35 were used by the Axis powers, acting mostly as reserve. Number 9. KV-1 from Soviet Union. First introduced in 1939, the KV were a series of heavy tanks operated with the Red Army, mostly in the first period of the conflict, been eventually replaced by the Iosif Stalin tank series. The first KV-1 prototype first saw combat during the Winter War, when the Soviets invaded Finland. Its heavy armor proved highly resistant to Finnish anti-tank weapons, making it very difficult to take out. Due to the outstanding performances, the tank entered in mass production in two different variants. The KV-1 armed with a 76mm gun, and the KV-2 armed with a 152mm howitzer gun designed to deal with heavy fortifications. As the production began in 1940 at a slow pace, only a handful of these were operational when the German invasion began, during the Operation Barbarossa. The KV-1 first met the Wehrmacht on 23 June 1941, the second day of the invasion, in the Battle of Raseiniai. The KV tanks were practically immune to all light-caliber anti-tank weapons, like those mounted on the early Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks fielded by the Germans at that time. Until the invaders equipped their armored vehicles with higher-caliber guns, the KV-1 was invulnerable to almost any German weapon, except the 88mm flak gun. Many variants have been suggested and developed to enhance the tank's protection and firepower, but as the war continued, the KV's production shifted mostly to the more advanced IS-1 and IS-2 tanks. Number 8. Churchill from Great Britain. The Churchill infantry tank was one of the heaviest Allied armored vehicle of World War II. Initially specified just before the outbreak of the conflict, the Churchill was meant to supplement or even replace the Matilda and Valentine infantry tanks. The first variant saw light in 1941, whose design was based in the expectation that war in Europe might be fought in conditions similar to those of the First World War, and thus emphasized the ability to cross difficult ground. At first, it was armed with a 40mm gun and a 76.2mm howitzer gun mounted on the hull, most likely inspired by the French B-1 heavy tank. But this first series, called Mark I, were plagued by teething problems, so they were relegated to training or reconverted into later versions. This led to the introduction of more sophisticated variants, like the Mark IV and Mark V, which were equipped with a better turret carrying a 57 and 75mm guns respectively, while the hull howitzer was replaced by a machine gun in order to gain extra space and simplify production. The Churchill took service basically in every Allied war theater. It first saw combat in France on 19 August 1942, been later used in North Africa, Italy, and in the Eastern Front operated by the Red Army, delivered via Lend-Lease. By 1943, the Churchill was the most heavily armored tank in British service, and it was seen as an adequate response to the German Tiger and Panther, if rearmed with a more potent weapon, like the 17-pounder. But by early 1945, only 6 prototypes had been built, and at the same time, scores of Sherman Fireflies were already available and battle-proven. Consequently, the Black Prince project, as it was known, was seen redundant and abandoned afterwards. Number 7. Tiger II from Germany. The King Tiger was one of Hitler's last gambles, set to reverse the difficult situation in which Germany found itself in the last stages of World War II. The first unit of TIS tank was built in 1943, and the production continued until 1945. The Tiger II was the successor to the Tiger I, combining the latter's thick armor with the armor sloping used on the Panther medium tank, giving the King Tiger an advantage against all opposing Allied and Soviet tanks attempting to engage it from head-on. That's why flanking maneuvers were most often used against it, to attempt a shot at the thinner side and rear armor. It was armed with the already proved 88mm PaK-43 gun, able to deal against any foe fielded tank, whether been medium or heavy. Although this vehicle could have won basically any tank engagement on even circumstances, it had a serious problem. Beyond the propaganda newsreels and its formidable appearance, the Tiger II was a very costly, over-engineered, and fuel-glutton lumbering beast prone to breakdowns, since it weighed 20 tons more than the Panther and had the same engine and transmission. Essentially, having access to the best tank of World War II doesn't really mean much if it couldn't be produced in many quantities. According to the information I found online, less than 500 units have been built throughout the conflict, also due to the constant Allied bombardment to the German industries. The first combat use of the Tiger II was on 18 July 1944, during the Battle of Normandy, opposing the Canadians' offensive, while in the Eastern Front, several King Tiger divisions were used on 12th August 1944, resisting the massive Soviet attack aimed to dislodge the German from Poland and Ukraine. But the tank's most important role was played on 15 October 1944, during the Operation Panzerfaust, supporting the German troops in taking the Hungarian capital of Budapest, which ensured that the country remained with the Axis until the end of the war. Number 6. IS-2 from Soviet Union. As the escalation between German and Russian engineers reached a new point with the introduction on the German side of the Panther and Tiger, and the knowledge that something bigger was brewing, the IS-2 was pressed into introduction as soon as its main armament was ready. This started in November 1943 at the Chelyabinsk factory, with a partly sloped frontal armor, thick, and moreover, its massive 122mm main gun. The new heavy tank seemed to be just the trump card Stalin needed to wash over any armored opposition on the Eastern Front, or so it seemed on paper. In reality, some shortcuts were taken to meet the expectations. These would prove real issues on the long run, starting with the gun itself slow to reload and with bulky naval ammunition. The IS-2 tank first saw combat in early 1944, equipped in Elite Guards heavy tank regiments of the Red Army, whose main duty were often to spearhead attempts to break through fortified German positions like anti-tank defense lines and bunkers. In Ukraine 1944, Soviets' armored divisions equipped with IS-2 tanks managed to defeat the German forces, supported by Tiger I tanks and Elephants tank destroyers, reporting minimal casualties. After the Second World War, as the concept of main battle tank emerged, the remaining IS-2 tanks were mostly used for training purposes or kept in storage. It remained in service much longer afterwards in the armies of Cuba, China, and North Korea. In case you are wondering why I didn't mention the IS-3 instead, it's because, despite being developed in late 1944, it didn't see combat during World War II. They simply arrived too late, after the surrender of Germany. Number 5. Tiger from Germany. The Tiger I began its operational duty in 1942 in Africa and in the Soviet Union, usually in independent heavy tank battalions. The Tiger was a formidable machine that pushed the boundaries of armored warfare, combining lethality with the best possible protection, forcing the Allies to devise better tanks. While the Tiger I has been called an outstanding design for its time, it has also been called over-engineered, using expensive materials and labor-intensive production methods. In the early period, the Tiger was prone to certain types of track failures and breakdowns. It was expensive to maintain, but generally mechanically reliable. Being the first German vehicle equipped with the iconic 88mm PaK-36 gun, it had far superior penetration and accuracy capabilities than the already existing 75mm cannons mounted on the Panzer IV tanks and Stug tank destroyers at that time. The Tiger first saw combat in September 1942 in Leningrad, and on December of the same year, it was used in the North African campaign, where Tiger tanks proved the effectiveness of their armor against enemy fire. These events greatly increased the confidence of the crews regarding the tank's quality, labeling it almost invulnerable to the tanks deployed by the British at that time. On February to May 1943, the greatest concentration of heavy German battalions equipped with Tiger tanks was prepared for Operation Citadel, However, after Kursk, tactical use changed from breakthrough operations to stopgap defensive actions, intensively moving from the hottest point of the front to another. The tank remained in service with the German Army until the end of World War II, but its production stopped after August 1944, phased out in favor of the Tiger II. Personally, this is my favorite World War II tank, the most renowned armored vehicle of all time in my opinion. And what's your favorite tank? Write a comment to let me know. Number 4. Panzer IV from Germany. This tank entered in service for the first time in 1936, and it was the most numerous German tank of the Second World War. Despite a well-dated general conception and the rise of the brand new generation of tanks that included the Panther, Tiger, and Tiger II, it was not only the mainstay of the Wehrmacht, but was also the chosen tank for many elite panzer divisions. The recipe of this success was probably its large hull and turret, easy maintenance, reliability, and a sturdy chassis, which allowed a more generous array of weapons than the Panzer III. The first variant, the F1, was equipped with a short 75mm gun designed primarily to support infantry, but in later variants like the F2 and H, the main armament was gradually replaced by a very effective high-velocity gun derived from the Pak-40, able to cope with the Russian T-34 and KV-1. The Panzer IV saw service in all combat theaters involving Germany. Its chassis was also used as base for numerous and more specialized variants, such as anti-air or tank destroyer. The Panzer IV was partially succeeded by the Panther medium tank, although it continued to be a significant component of German armored formations to the end of the war. Due to its relatively cheap cost, nearly 9,000 units of this tank have been produced during World War II, and for this reason the Panzer IV was one of the most widely exported German tanks of the conflict, with around 300 sold to Finland, Romania, Spain, and Bulgaria. Number 3. M4 Sherman from USA. I would say that everyone with interest in World War II knows this tank. First introduced in 1942 as replacement for the M3 Lee, the Sherman was the most widely used medium tank by the United States and Western allies of the conflict. The first batches of M4 were sent to the British Army through Lend-Lease as soon as they were ready and fought in Africa. They found themselves instrumental in many operations which turned the tide of the war in this sector in favor of the Allies. At first, production rate was of 1,000 Shermans a month, but rose quickly as more factories were involved to a figure of 2,000 each month by mid-1942. The development of the M4 Sherman emphasized key factors such as reliability, ease of production, and standardization. The U.S. Army and the designers prioritized durability and maintenance ease, which ensured the tank could be quickly repaired in the field. These design principles were essential for meeting the demands of mass production and quick deployment. The M4 Sherman was first armed with a 75mm gun, able to deal effectively against German light and medium tanks during the early stages of the war. But as the Axis started fielding heavier and much powerful tanks, the Sherman began to be equipped with a 76mm gun and high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition to compete against the threats. Many variants have been developed during the conflict, focusing primarily in improving the effectiveness of the armor, both of the hull and turret. The M4 Sherman saw widespread use across various theaters of combat, including North Africa, Italy, and Western Europe. After World War II, the Sherman, particularly the many improved and upgraded versions, continued to see combat service in many conflicts around the world, including the Korean War, with Israel and the Arab-Israeli Wars, and on both sides of the Indo-Pakistani War of 1965. Number 2. Panther from Germany. The Panther medium tank was used by Germany in most European theaters of World War II from mid-1943 to the end of the conflict in May 1945. Primarily designed to counter the Soviet T-34 and to replace the Panzer III and Panzer IV, it was equipped with the same engine of the Tiger I, but the Panther had better gun penetration, was lighter and faster, and could traverse rough terrain better than other German heavy tanks. Being one of the best balanced designs of World War II, the Panther is labeled by many military historians as one of the top tanks of the conflict, with a respectable number of 6,000 units built. The Panther's 75mm gun was one of the most powerful of the Second World War, due to the large propellant charge and the long barrel, which gave it a very high muzzle velocity and excellent armor-piercing qualities. The front hull had 80mm of armor angled at 55 degrees. This combination of moderately thick and well-sloped armor meant that heavy Allied weapons were needed in order to assure its penetration at normal combat ranges. This tank saw combat both in the Western and Eastern Front, but the most notorious action fought by Panther divisions were during the Ardennes offensive in 1944, being tasked to try stopping the Allied advance with counterattacks. The Panther demonstrated its prowess in open country, but also its vulnerability in the close-in fighting of the small towns of the Ardennes, where they suffered heavy losses due to the never-ending Allied bombing to the German industries, and with the consequent drastic slowdown in the production of new units. The constant demands for maintenance and spare parts couldn't be met. This compounded the problems with the operational Panthers already deployed and their reliability, as the tanks in the field had to be cannibalized for parts. Number 1. T-34 from Soviet Union. The T-34 was the mainstay of the Soviet Red Army armored forces throughout the war. The goal behind this project was to create some kind of universal tank, designed to be equipped with a diesel engine, less sensitive than petrol engines, both to increase range and avoid the tanks to burst in flames too easily as other BT-5 and BT-7 did during the war against Japan and Manchuria. When introduced, its 76mm gun was more powerful than many of its contemporaries, and its 60-degree sloped armor provided good protection against anti-tank weapons. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the T-34 proved to be superior to any tank the Germans then had in service. Initially, the Wehrmacht had great difficulty destroying T-34 in combat, forcing them to deploy higher caliber guns on the battlefield, like the 88mm flak gun, and to design more powerful tanks. At the same time, the Soviets incrementally upgraded the T-34. Good examples of this were the Model 1942 and 1943, which featured increased armor on the turret and many simplified components. However, something was still missing. The Germans improved not only the weaponry of their tanks, but their armor as well. Soviet firing tests against a captured Tiger I heavy tank in April 1943 showed that the T-34's 76mm gun could not penetrate the front of the German tank at all. The 52K, a Soviet 85mm anti-air gun, was found capable of doing the job, and so derivatives of it were developed for tanks. As a result, the new T-34-85 model production began in January 1944 and remained in service until the end of the conflict. The Soviets ultimately built over 80,000 T-34 of all variants. This tank was widely exported after World War II. Some units still see service to this day in the armed forces of North Korea, Vietnam, and Yemen. By the way, if you liked the video, please consider to support me by clicking the like and subscribe button. See you in the next mission.